Why is there so much pain and suffering in the world that we live in if God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good? And nothing exemplifies the pain and suffering that we see in nature more than disease caused by pathogens like viruses and bacteria. In fact, people struggle with this issue of how could God create bacteria and viruses? Questions like these keep seekers and skeptics alike away from the Christian faith. Thankfully, I'm joined today by Dr. A.J. Roberts, who's a virologist, a molecular biologist, and a Christian who's going to help us address this difficult issue. In a previous episode, you talked about the idea that we could think of bacteria and viruses as part of God's good creation, but also they, in some instances, could reflect the consequences of the fall, and that even the idea of God's plan of redemption factors into how we think about viruses and bacteria. So today we want to focus on the fall and the consequences of the fall. So how do we think about the origin of viruses and bacteria in light of the fall?
So when I think about the origins of viruses, I want to be careful not to paint all viruses with the same broad stroke. I think different viruses originate in different ways. And I actually see the origins of viruses related both to the creation and the fall. But when we specifically talk about the fall, I again think in a couple of categories. The diversity of viruses suggests not just that they had multiple origins, but that the source of their origin was probably also very diverse. And so I often think and have thought about viruses for years in the context of broken cellular machinery. If we think about all the different cells that have existed through all of the time that life has existed and changed on the planet's surface, then we're talking about a vast number of different types of cells. And if you think about the different ways that cells might be able to break down or the different ways that cells replicate, then it makes sense that you would find a very broad diversity of viruses. And if you look at viruses, the things that basically make up or comprise viruses are different types of nucleic acid. And I don't want to get too technical, but you can have a variety of different types of nucleic acid in different kinds of viruses, and viruses can replicate using very different strategies for replication. And so I think that parallels nicely the diversity that we see in living organisms and living cells. And so I've often thought of them in the context of broken cellular machinery. But that doesn't mean that viruses that infect humans necessarily came from broken human cells. They may have arisen from broken other kinds of cells, animals, or maybe even plant cells, because viruses infect pretty much every kind of cell that's alive. So I think of many pathogens as broken cellular machinery. But I also think that some of the viruses that we discover today that are pathogens, like I just mentioned, they don't originate in the human organism. They actually originate in other species, and then through a process of mutation and perhaps repeated exposure, they do what we call a species jump. And they may have a symbiotic effect in the species they come from, or no effect. You can't tell that animal has a virus.
They may be actually playing a good role.
They may be playing a good role, but they at least have a neutral role in many of the cases. Yet when they cross the species barrier, they can actually cause disease in humans or in other animals if they didn't originate there. So I'm not really sure that would be an aspect of the fall. It might just be an aspect of a byproduct of creation. You know, if viruses are having a symbiotic effect in one organism, but then they make a species jump, they may create disease.
But you know, Scripture tells us too that we were given the command to subdue the planet, to be caretakers of the planet. And of course, in a fallen state, we struggle to do that. So you could easily see that in a fallen state, we mismanage the creation, and through mismanaging it, maybe we expose ourselves to these viruses in bacteria that are in other organisms that otherwise we wouldn't if we were properly managing the creation.
That's a great insight. Yeah.
You know, so you have examples of like HIV arising from the simian immunodeficiency virus and things like that.
Right. So. Or SARS coming from bats through some other organism.
Right. So thinking about, again, the origin of viruses, then we can see them as part of God's good creation. We can see them in some instances as a consequence of the fall. So it's really a complex model we need to take into account when we think about viruses from a Christian perspective.